Hearing is now resumed.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Commissioner. It's Wendy Baker for the Commission with Lara Tesoro. Today we are dealing with Project 2 with the lead author, Don McDonald, here to testify. So we should probably get started with having him sworn in these proceedings, and then we can mark the report and deal with the various documents.
All right. You solemnly affirm that the evidence to be given by you to this hearing shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Would you state your full name, please?
Donald Douglas McDonald.
Thank you. Counsel?
Don McDonald is the author, the lead author on technical report number 2, which is titled The Potential Effects of Contaminants on Fraser River Sockeye Salmon. If that could be identified and marked as the next report.
Exhibit 826.
And just to get the paper out of the way, Mr. McDonald, there was an errata sheet that you prepared to correct some typographical errors in your report, and that's been circulated to all parties. I'd like that marked, please, as the next exhibit.
827.
Thank you. Now I'd like to review the CVs of the authors, starting with you, Dr. McDonald, or Mr. McDonald. Your CV is on the screen in front of you, and this has been again circulated to all parties. I think I'll first have it marked as the next exhibit, please. I thought first, if Mr. McDonald, could you confirm this is your CV?
Yes, that's my CV.
Okay, if that could be marked, please.
Exhibit 828.
Thank you. And you were assisted in this report by a number of members of your staff, and their CVs are also available here and should be marked along with this report. And I'd like to start with Mira Crawford. This is the CV of Mira Crawford.
Yes, that's correct.
And she assisted you in preparing this report.
Yes, she did.
I'll have that marked, please.
Exhibit 829.
Next is the CV of Melissa Mengetti. Again, this is a person on your staff who assisted you in the preparation of the report.
Yes, and she was formerly on my staff. She's since moved on, but yes, this is her CV that was correct and complete at the time that the report was prepared.
Thank you. Could I have that marked, please?
Exhibit 830.
Next is Heather Prensip, also a member of your staff who assisted.
Yes, that's correct.
And this is her CV.
Yes, it is.
Could I have that marked, please?
831.
And then finally, Jesse Sinclair, also a member of your staff.
Yes, that's correct.
And assisted you in the preparation of the report.
Yes, he did.
And this is his CV.
Yes, it is.
Could I have this marked, please?
Exhibit 832.
Thank you. Now I'd like to turn to Exhibit 828, which is your CV, Mr. McDonald, and just review with you. You have a Bachelor's of Science in Zoology from the University of British Columbia.
That's correct.
And you identify on your CV your area of specialization. You identify that you are a principal of McDonald Environmental Sciences Ltd., and that, of course, is the entity under which this document was prepared.
That's correct.
And your company was established to provide scientific consulting services in the fields of fisheries and aquatic resource management, stream ecology, environmental quality guidelines and policy development, environmental risk and hazard assessment, information and technology transfer.
That's correct.
And you are a specialist in environmental toxicology and chemistry, ecosystem-based resource management, water quality, water use, interactions, and sediment quality assessments.
Yes, I am.
And if we turn through, your professional memberships and professional activities are set out on the first page. Turning to page 3, this begins 33 pages of citations of technical reports and publications which you have authored or contributed to in these areas that we've just identified.
That's correct.
And just highlighting a couple of them, you've done recently in 2011, and you have worked on baseline ecological risk assessment of the Calcasieu estuary in Louisiana, various publications in relation to that.
Yes, a labor of love that's gone on for 10 years.
Looking at the predictive ability of effects-based sediment quality guidelines in that system,
Correct?
and looking at baseline ecological risk assessment of that estuary, including an evaluation of the risk to benthic invertebrates associated with exposure to contaminated sediments.
Yes, that's correct.
Right. And you've done similar work throughout Canada and the US.
Yes, that's correct.
Just highlighting a couple of things here. You, in 2010, prepared a document or a book entitled Tools for Assessing Contaminated Sediments in Freshwater, Estuarine, and Marine Ecosystems.
Yes, it was a book chapter.
Okay. And you were also in 2009 and 2010, you prepared publications titled Designing Monitoring Programs for Water Quality Based on Experience in Canada. So that was a two-part publication, one developing theory and framework and one setting up monitoring tools.
That's correct, yes.
I'm not going to obviously go through all of your lengthy publications, but I do, if I can ask you to turn to page 8, where the technical reports are set out, and just identify that in 2010 you were involved in a handbook for assessing risk to fish and wildlife associated with the potential use of water, treated wastewater, stormwater, sediment, soil, biosolids, or other materials on units of the National Wildlife Refuge System, and that appears to be a 4-volume publication that you were involved in 2010?
That's correct, for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Thank you. You have also in 2010, you prepared a paper on the status and trends of environmental quality conditions in the transboundary reach of the Slave River in Northwest Territories.
That's correct.
And I've just highlighted some of the publications, of which there are many. And Mr. Commissioner, I will be asking that Mr. McDonald be qualified as an expert in environmental toxicology and chemistry with particular expertise in ecological risk assessment and ecosystem-based management, water quality and water use interactions, design and evaluation of contaminated sediments on ecological receptors, including fish, and the design and implementation of environmental quality monitoring programs. I understand that there are some council that would like to speak to the qualifications of Mr. McDonald as well. Why don't we start with the province of BC?
Callan, C-A-L-L-A-N, initials T-E, appearing on behalf of Her Majesty the Queen Mary, the province of British Columbia. Mr. McDonald, your degree is an undergraduate degree in zoology from UBC.
Yes, that's correct.
You do not have a PhD, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. You do not have a degree in toxicology?
That's correct.
Okay. But other schools in Canada do offer such a program?
Yes, they do.
Okay. In university, did you take any courses in toxicology?
Not directly, no.
Okay. Which ones did you take indirect?
A number of science-based courses, either on ecology of freshwater organisms, ecology of saltwater organisms, how they interact with the environment, things like that. Various chemistry courses as well, and as part of the work that I was doing outside my degree, that's where I gained most of my experience in toxicology.
Okay. You would agree, though, that toxicology is an independent discipline in the biological sciences field?
Can you explain, please, what you mean by that?
Well, there are people that do PhDs in toxicology and are retained as professional toxicologists that...
I'm not aware of such a designation.
Okay. So you haven't published any papers which evaluate the toxicological effects on sockeye salmon by different contaminants at different concentrations?
Not as directly as I think the way you mean that question.
Okay.
So what I mean by that is I have reviewed the toxicological data on a wide variety of contaminants in the environment and published on those topics. And as part of those investigations, there may have been data that we looked at, evaluated, and considered in the process that was on the toxicity of those substances to sockeye specifically, and or other salmonid species.
Okay, but you didn't do any of the primary research. You did review research only.
That's correct.
Okay. And you have not published any papers which establish toxicological effects on any fish species. So my first question was, specific to sockeye. Now I'm broadening it to all fish.
Can you please restate that question, please?
Okay. You have not published any papers which establish toxicological effects on any fish species.
No, that's incorrect.
Okay, which papers did you do?
So you will find, for example, early on in my CV, you'll see papers on the effects of pesticides like dicamba. If you find a series of publications by Coe et al., there'll be probably 1993 or something like that. Anyway, they included evaluations of toxicity of a variety. There's a series of papers that evaluate toxicity of a variety of different substances on fish and other aquatic organisms.
Okay, and again, this was review papers, not direct primary research?
That's correct.
Okay. And you'd agree that your papers are largely on water quality standards as opposed to observed toxicological effects?
No, that's not correct.
Okay, could you explain?
Yes. So you will see in my CV a number of papers that are essentially reviews of the literature where we look at the toxicity of this substance on that organism, for example, and evaluate that data to support the generation of either water quality guidelines, sediment quality guidelines, or tissue residue guidelines. But you'll also see in my CV a number of publications where we have reported the results of things like baseline ecological risk assessments. That's where we will take environmental samples from the field, and we will subject various toxicity test organisms to those either test sediments or water, and then use those results to evaluate the toxicity of that material to those species.
Okay, those are my questions.
For the record, Leadham Initial T appearing as counsel for the Conservation Coalition. Good morning, Ms. McDonald.
Good morning.
I want to ask you, I'm content with your qualifications, but I want to make sure that when I ask you some questions that may arise during the course of my cross-examination of you that's to come later, that you're qualified to give me some answers in certain areas. And I want to explore with you, based upon your expertise and experience, whether you possess that necessary qualifications to ask the questions that I'm contemplating putting to you. Before I do that, I want to make sure that I go through some of the technical reports that you have worked on. You've done a considerable amount of work for the province of British Columbia, according to the technical reports section of your resume. Is that correct?
Yes, we've done some work for the province of British Columbia.
And for example, if I ask you to turn to page 19 of the report, about 2/3 of the way down, this is a report that you co-authored in 2004, entitled Criteria for Contaminated Sites, Criteria for Managing Contaminated Sediment in British Columbia. And this was a technical appendix that you prepared for the Environmental Management Branch, British Columbia Ministry of Water, Land and Air Protection.
That's correct.
And you've done other work for the province of British Columbia over the years, including an evaluation of sediment quality conditions in the vicinity of Macaulay Point and Clover Point outfalls. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you also did a workshop to support the development of guidance on the assessment of contaminated sediments in British Columbia. I'm looking at page 14 of your resume under the heading of technical reports, the second item down.
That's correct.
You've done a considerable amount of work in other jurisdictions other than British Columbia, Louisiana, Missouri, Pennsylvania. It seems that you've been quite a globetrotter in terms of the work that you've done in other jurisdictions. Is that fair to say?
Well, I'd like to keep most of my work within North America, but yes, that's correct.
And you've also done work for the Northwest Territories, have you?
Yes, that's correct.
What are you doing, or what have you done for the Northwest Territories?
A variety of different things. We've designed environmental quality monitoring programs for places like the Slave River, for the Peel, for the Liard River as well. Those are sort of three of the main river systems up in the Northwest Territories. We've also assisted them, various participants in the process, in the regulatory process in the Northwest Territories, with evaluation of things like applications for mining projects, particularly diamond mining. We've evaluated decommissioning plans for mine sites, gold mine sites in the Northwest Territories.
So when you say that you're associated with helping them in their regulatory process, you would have been familiar then with the permitting system in the Northwest Territories and how that functions?
Yes.
And you would have been consulted with respect to conditions upon point sources of pollution and how that ought to be regulated in that province or that territory?
Yes.
And are you familiar somewhat with the permitting system as it applies in British Columbia as well?
Generally, yes.
All right, those are my questions. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. In terms of the qualifications that I proposed he be qualified as.
May you just kindly just read those back to me just a little slower? I
Sure.
just was trying to make a note of it.
Yep.
Thank you.
An expert in environmental toxicology and chemistry with expertise in ecological risk assessment and ecosystem-based management, water quality and water use interactions, design and evaluation of contaminated sediments on ecological receptors, including fish, design and implementation of environmental quality monitoring programs.
Is the eco risk assessment and ecosystem-based management, are those linked together or are those separate?
Perhaps Mr. McDonald can identify how those are described.
Those are separate.
Separately?
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much, Ms. Bain.
Thank you. So is he now qualified in
Yes.
those areas? Thank
Thank
you. Mr. McDonald, I'd like to just do a bit of an overview of what you did for this report, and I'm just going to run through an overview with you of what I understand the report to contain, and you can just confirm whether I've got it right or not. I understand that this report, the first stage was to define the geographic and temporal scope of the investigation, followed by the creation of an inventory of aquatic contaminants, followed by a preliminary evaluation of contaminants of concern, then actually doing a full evaluation of contaminants of concern you were able to assess, then looking at potential effects of endocrine disrupting chemicals and contaminants of emerging concern. That was the first part, or
Yeah.
the first of many parts.
Yes, that's correct.
You also, in doing that work, identified uncertainties and data gaps as you did the work,
Yes, we did.
and you've provided a set of recommendations for the Commissioner.
Indeed.
Okay. So I'd like to begin with the first phase that I described, which was identifying the spatial and temporal scope, which you focused on in your work. And I wonder if you could just identify how you did that. How did you identify the temporal and spatial scope? And
Yes.
just as we do that, I wonder if you might want to if participants might want to have pages 9 and 10, and the Commissioner have pages 9 and 10 open of the report, because that is where you do review it, if that's of some assistance.
There we are. Yes. So what we did was we obtained information on the distribution of sockeye salmon within the Fraser River Basin. Then we conducted an evaluation of the availability of surface water chemistry, sediment chemistry, and other types of data that could be used to evaluate conditions within the Fraser River Basin. We integrated those two types of information to identify a scope of the study area that would encompass the distribution of sockeye salmon within the system, and throughout each of their life stages, through incubation and through spawning and incubation, through rearing, and then through the outmigration and upstream migration as well of the adults. And so what we tried to do was make sure that our scope of the study area was inclusive of all of those areas, but was able to be evaluated using the data that were available to us. And so what we ultimately focused on then was identifying a total of 15 areas of interest within the Fraser River Basin that would provide us with a basis for evaluating those conditions and how those conditions then might be influencing the abundance of sockeye salmon.
Right, and those areas of interest begin on page 9 and carry over through page 10?
That's correct.
Okay. And in terms of the temporal scope of the work, how did you identify that?
Our interest was to be able to understand the factors, contaminant-based factors that could be influencing the decline of sockeye salmon over the last 20 years. And so we wanted to make sure that we captured the last 20 years plus a period of time before that, so that we would have a basis for comparing information on environmental quality conditions prior to these major declines in sockeye salmon and after the declines had begun, so that we could compare those results and determine whether there had been any major changes in conditions within the system. So what we did was we looked at the data that we had, looked at the temporal coverage that we had, and determined that we had sufficient data that we believed were reliable from 1965 on to present. And so that's what defined the scope of the temporal scope of our study.
And did you have reliable data for all of the areas of interest for that full scope?
No, we did not. We had some major challenges in terms of being able to identify sufficient quantities of data to characterize conditions within each of the areas that we wanted to characterize conditions during the life stages that the animals were actually exposed to those conditions. So we found that we had some major data gaps as we tried to develop that database to support that analysis.
I take it in your analysis you used water quality data from some source?
That's correct.
Where did you get that? What sources did you use for water quality data?
Well, we looked for water quality data from a variety of different sources, and ultimately what we relied upon was the data that is comprised in the province of British Columbia's environmental monitoring system for the water quality data.
Okay. And by using that data, were you able to precisely relate water quality data, both spatially and temporally, with where and when the sockeye were spawning and rearing?
No.
Why not?
We had challenges in terms of linking and finding data that would specifically relate to, for example, spawning areas. So we frequently had data that characterized main stems of rivers, oftentimes below the rearing lakes that the sockeye were utilizing, but only very infrequently did we have data, for example, that characterized conditions in the headwater systems where the sockeye were spawning in many cases. And so we had that sort of spatial disconnect between where the animals were actually utilizing habitats and where the environmental quality monitoring data had been collected. And similarly, we had challenges in linking, ensuring that we had the appropriate data for the right times of the year when the animals were actually using those habitats. So for spawning and incubation, for example, the eggs are deposited in the early fall, and then the elevens and the fry leave the gravel in the spring. Frequently, we have a lot of data for the summer period, but not necessarily a lot of data for that fall, winter, and early spring period. And so that temporal disconnect between when we wanted to be able to characterize conditions and where we were able to characterize conditions created data gaps for us.
Right. So how did you address those challenges?
Well, what we did was we used the data that we had to characterize conditions as well as we could, and we made a number of assumptions along the way. So, for example, if we didn't have data to characterize a rearing lake, for example, Quesnel Lake, but we had data collected at the outlet of Quesnel Lake in the Quesnel River, we would apply that information to the river, to the lake itself, with an understanding that this was not the preferred way to characterize conditions within that lake, but it if you believe that the water that was in the river came out of the lake, which we believe that it did, it provided a basis for understanding what the exposure could have been in the lake. It's imperfect, but we had to use the data that we had in that kind of creative way to try to characterize exposures as best we could.
And are you satisfied with those methods that you used to address the challenges?
Yeah, I'm satisfied with the methods. I'm unsatisfied with the underlying data, though.
And the underlying data, I take it, the monitoring sites that are, these are ones that are administered by the province?
They may be administered by the provinces, or they may be federal provincial sites. In some cases, they may have been sites that were where the data were collected by others, and then the data were provided to the province for incorporation into the EMS system.
And they're not data collection sites that are specific for Fraser River sockeye, right? They have other uses.
They are almost entirely for other uses. In fact, I'm not aware of any water quality monitoring program that was designed explicitly for Fraser River sockeye.
I'd like to move now to the inventory that you did of aquatic contaminants, and I'm going to make some use of the tables. Mr. Commissioner, hopefully you have those in the report before you. To start on this discussion, I'd like to turn to tables 3.25 and 3.26, 3.27. So those, just grab the page numbers for you. You'll see that the pages in this section for the tables are labeled T dash number. So starting at T78, which is 3.25. Once we all have that, I'll just ask you some overview questions. Okay. So what were you doing in the section where you did the inventory of aquatic contaminants, just as a sort of broad brush? What was the intention?
Just so we make sure everybody has the right information on the screen, we'll want to go down to T.
Yeah, should be
T78.
T78. It's 3.25.
I'm sorry, now I'm paying attention again.
Yeah, up 78, T78. Oops, there you go. Okay, so what was the intention of the, how did you do it on a broad brush, the inventory of aquatic contaminants?
Yes, so we did this evaluation of or development of the inventory of aquatic contaminants using a multi-step process. And the first step was to ask the question, what kinds of human activities, anthropogenic activities, are ongoing within the Fraser River Basin, and where are those activities occurring? And so we compiled information, geographically based information, using a geographic information system, data that was available from a variety of different sources to identify where the various land uses were occurring within the Fraser River Basin. And as you can see across this table, if you look across the columns of the table, we included or compiled information on a broad range of activities, including pulp and paper mills, sawmills, plywoods, mills, etc., wood preservation facilities, cement plants, seafood processing facilities, operating in abandoned mines, oil and gas developments, bulk storage and shipping facilities, other types of manufacturing facilities, and that's sort of a term as a catch-all for a variety of other types of manufacturing facilities. We looked at contaminated sites and spills that have occurred within the system. Those two separate things, but they were captured within one title. Municipal wastewater treatment facilities, landfills, salmon enhancement facilities, lake fertilization projects. So those are the key point sources of contaminants within the system. But we also recognized that there was a number of non-point sources that potentially could have contributed contaminants into the system. And so we looked at the distribution of activities related to forest management, to agricultural developments. We looked for municipal stormwater runoff areas, and looked at runoff from linear developments, and then also recognizing that there are atmospheric sources that potentially could be contributing contaminants to the river basin. We looked at both natural and anthropogenic sources. So this was the first real step, was to characterize geographically where each of these types of activities occurred within the river basin.
Okay.
Then if we go down to table 3.26, then we ask the question, for each one of these activities, for example, pulp and paper mills, what are the types of contaminants that are typically associated with each of those activities? And then we characterize those. And what you see in this particular table is not a comprehensive list of contaminants. What it identifies as classes of contaminants. We've called them analytical groups here, or analyte groups. For each of the types of activities, then, like pulp and paper mills, you'll see little check marks which indicate whether or not, for example, nutrients or metals or phenolic compounds or chlorinated phenolics are associated with that type of activity.
Okay.
And this information was garnered from the scientific literature. We did a review of the literature on each one of these activities, compiled information from a variety of different sources to support the identification of which contaminants are associated with each one of these activities.
All right, and then if we turn to the next page, 3.27.
And what this table does is it integrates the information from the latter two tables, 3.25 and 3.26, to identify which contaminants are likely to be associated with each of the areas of interest within the Fraser River Basin. And if you look at the final column, it identifies the classes of contaminants that are associated with or have likely been released into the Fraser River Basin as a whole. So this provides then the inventory of the classes of contaminants that we believe have been released into the river basin.
And then if I can ask you to turn to table 8.1, which is on T261, begins on 253, goes on for a number of pages.
What is the table number?
It's table 8.1, and begins on page T253. Okay, and this, how does this inventory of aquatic contaminants interrelate to the tables we've just reviewed?
So this table is very much like the earlier table, 3.27, with one major exception, and that is instead of identifying contaminant classes only, within each of the classes of contaminants, we also identify the individual contaminants that have been associated or likely to have been released into each of the areas of interest and to the Fraser River as a whole. And so when viewed in total, then this table 8.1 then provides our inventory of aquatic contaminants for the Fraser River Basin.
Right. And in your view, how complete is the inventory in 8.1?
This table identifies some 200 or so contaminants that have been released. I don't know what the exact number is. I may have counted them at some point, but I don't remember the number offhand now. It's clear to me that there have been thousands of contaminants that have been released into the system. But what I believe that this inventory does, it identifies the contaminants that are the most likely to be risk drivers within the Fraser River Basin, either for effects on sockeye or other aquatic organisms within the system. So I believe that this is an inventory that can be used to evaluate the potential effects of releases of contaminants into the system. If used in this way, we are unlikely to have missed important contaminants that could be driving effects.
And table 8.1 it's not just on T253, it actually carries on for a number of pages and completes on page 266. I don't want to spend too much time on the tables, but just that form the backup for some of these summaries we've just reviewed. But I just wanted to understand how some of these tables in section 3 may be useful, and to understand how what the data actually refers to. If you turn to table 3.1, this beginning at 3.1 and going through to 3.12 sets out in some detail the different activities and the permits that are issued under or by various authorities in relation to those different activities. So if we look at 3.1, for example, which is on page T9, this would show the different pulp and paper mills in the Fraser River Basin. It shows the discharge, some summary discharge information, and under the column variable listed in effluent permits, it would show what's actually been permitted under a regulatory regime.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so if I ask you to turn to one for mining as an example on page T23, this is table 3.7. It sets out in the same way variables listed in effluent permits. You see a number of the chemicals listed there.
Yes.
It's on the screen here, there. So that goes on for a couple of pages. You'll see it beginning on the Tech Resources mine at the bottom, and if you can just scroll down to the next page, you can see other mining effluent permits listed there.
Yes.
Okay, if I ask you to turn to page 22 of your report, where you have provided the text summary of different industries and the pollutants associated with those industries. Just as a comparison, the mining section, which begins on page 20, if we move through that and we turn to page 22, which is the end, you set out various discharges associated with mining activities. You see those there?
Yes.
Bulleted. Would those discharges that you have on page 22 reflect all of the effluents that are shown on the permits we just reviewed in table 3.7?
No, typically the permitted, the monitoring that is required under the effluent permits is a subset of the variables that are likely to have been released from a mining facility. And that is typically is true of other sectors as well.
All right, so the list in the text of your report, page 22 for mining, is a broader grouping of contaminants than what we see in the effluent permits.
Correct, yes. Based on our review, we believe that there is a broader list of contaminants that have been released beyond those which are identified within the effluent permits themselves.
And in terms of information that you relied on for, if we turn to page 15, this is part of your pulp and paper text. What did you use to obtain the information on page 15, which sets out the contaminants associated with pulp and paper?
We conducted a review of the scientific literature, identified a number of documents that provided us with information on what the characteristics of pulp mill effluents look like, what they are likely to contain. Those references are identified explicitly in these bulleted points, and I think there's probably something on the order of 7 or 8 different documents that we've relied upon here between the Johansson and Ross 2002 paper, the Suntio et al. 1988, which is a very thorough characterization of the substances that are contained within bleached kraft pulp mill effluent. And then you'll see a variety of other references also that were used, the Mod Al 89, and a variety of others that are included in this list.
Okay. And in your view, that's a complete list, or fairly as complete as you can make it?
I believe we did the review of the literature. We found that these documents provided us with a very good, what we believe was a good indication of the contaminants that are likely to be found in those pulp mills. There are likely other documents also that could have been used in that evaluation. It's likely, though, that the list that we've identified based on the use of these documents would identify all or most of the risk drivers that are associated with releases from pulp mill facilities here in the province.
Right, and you identified, as we were going through one of the earlier tables, that you had listed contaminated sites, or you had assessed contaminated sites. What information did you use to do that assessment?
Yes, that is correct. There is a contaminated sites registry here in the province, and we attempted to access that information. My understanding was that it was under development, or under redevelopment is probably more correctly stated, at the time that we were doing this work, and so that was not available electronically to us. And so we had some discussions with the folks at the land remediation branch. They were able to provide us with some indication of the number of contaminated sites that occur within the Fraser River Basin, some 3,000 up to 1995, and a current number is something more in the order of something like 5,000 sites within the system. But we were unable to get the information on those, where those sites occur spatially within the system at the time that we were doing this work. And so we reviewed other sources, potential sources of information on contaminated sites. We identified one, a database that was being administered by Treasury Board, and ultimately we relied upon the data within that database to help us to identify spatially where the contaminated sites were occurring within the system, and what types of contaminated sites occurred within the system. One thing to note is that the Treasury Board database had information on about 1,000 contaminated sites within the basin, and based on our discussions with the province, there were some 5,000 currently in the system. So, you know, our evaluation may be representative of where those contaminated sites occur, but it's certainly not comprehensive.
So there may be more contaminated sites than what you were able to pinpoint when you did the report?
Based on the information provided to me by the province, we believe there's another 4,000 beyond the ones that we explicitly identified in our review, yes.
Thank you. All right. Once you had identified this broad inventory of contaminants, you had to do some evaluation to try and drill down on what were the contaminants of concern, and that, I take it, is what you did in these chapter 4 preliminary evaluation of chemicals of potential concern?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so how did you do this? What screening methodology did you use to go through the contaminants, the broad brush contaminants that you had identified?
So we used a methodology that is termed a screening level ecological risk assessment. It's a approach that is used consistently at contaminated sites in Canada and the United States. There's a standard guidance on how to conduct this type of assessment that has been put out by US EPA, and the Canadian Council of Ministers of Environment have also put out guidance on how to conduct this screening level risk assessment, as has the Science Advisory Board here in British Columbia, which provides the tools that are used within the contaminated sites assessment system here in British Columbia.
Right, and is there a way to describe how you did this preliminary evaluation?
Yeah, the way that I like to describe a screening level risk assessment is the goal is really threefold. One is to identify those contaminants that pose potential risks to ecological receptors, plants and animals, that occur in the environment. To identify the substances that don't pose potential risks, and those that we're uncertain about. So that's really the threefold thrust behind this approach. And the metaphor that I use to sort of describe this is one of a sieve, and where we're looking at particles of a variety of different sizes, and the larger size particles are the ones that are potential risk drivers or uncertain risk drivers, and the very small ones are the things that are probably not contributing to risk to ecological receptors. So in this first analysis, we use a sieve that has a very fine mesh, So it's very conservative, and we capture most of the contaminants on top of that, and they go through the next phase of the analysis. And what goes through are the contaminants that really have a very low probability of having caused or substantially contributed to any adverse effects on ecological receptors within the system.
Would the contaminants that could fall through your sieve, would they also include ones where you just don't have enough information to assess whether they're harmful or not? There's just not enough data?
Well, we retain those as something called uncertain contaminants of concern, and then those automatically go into the next phase of the analysis. So those don't get dropped behind, those get brought along, because understanding the potential effects of those uncertain contaminants of concern can be very important in the whole assessment process.
Right. So for each area of interest, did you determine exposure point concentrations for contaminants as part of this process?
Yes, we did.
And can you explain what those are and how they were used?
Yeah, what we did was we identified, again, this first level of assessment is intended to be very conservative. And so what we used was a maximum concentration of each of the contaminants of potential concern to identify the level of those substances to which the organisms could be exposed. So for example, for each of the areas of interest, we identified the very maximum concentration of cadmium that had been measured in water. And then that get carried through also to the basin-wide assessment, so that if it didn't matter what any of those other lower concentrations were, we only paid attention to the highest concentration to determine whether that was a potential, posing a potential risk to the environment.
Okay, and that was done on an area of interest basis?
Yes, and for the study area as a whole as well.
Okay. And also toxicity screening levels, you also used those in your work?
Yes, that's correct.
And can you explain what they are and how they were used?
Yes, a toxicity screening level is or value is a measure of the toxicity of a particular contaminant. And so for cadmium, for example, you could select any number of toxicity screening values from high levels that are associated with certain types of effects on a very specific species to concentrations that are expected to be protective of all species in the aquatic environment. And so what we selected was a very conservative toxicity screening values, typically Canadian Water Quality Guidelines, which are intended to provide a high level of protection to all species of aquatic organisms over extended periods of exposure. And protect all the life stages of those organisms. So they're intended to be very conservative toxicity screening values. That's what we selected in this case for doing this evaluation.
Fish were at as they moved through these areas of interest, and what contaminants were in the waters at that time?
Yes, yeah, we did this analysis looking at 4 separate life stages of sockeye salmon. So we looked at the period of time within which we expected to see eggs and elevens incubating within the Fraser River Basin. We call that the incubation period. We looked at and characterized exposures for the rearing period when the sockeye are largely within these nursery lakes within the system. And also we characterized conditions during downstream migration of sockeye smolts and upstream migration of adult sockeye as they're headed to the spawning grounds.
For surface water contaminants, you have a couple of tables that I wanted to get you to explain. They're found one is found at T201, so it's table 4.49. 4.49 is the table, the page is T201.
Yes.
Okay, so can you explain what's being described on these tables?
Yes, and if you move up one page, I believe, 4 point. No, that's good. That's good, I'm sorry.
So just for the record, this table is titled Summary of Hazards Posed to Sockeye Salmon Exposed to Surface Water Within the Fraser River Basin.
Yeah, so this table summarizes the results of the hazard evaluation for the entire river basin. And what it reports are something called hazard quotients. And you'll recollect a moment or two ago we spoke about two separate things. One was an exposure point concentration, and the second was a toxicity screening value. A hazard quotient is calculated by dividing that exposure point concentration by the toxicity screening value. And so where you have a hazard quotient greater than 1, you have a concentration of that particular substance that is sufficient to pose a potential risk to aquatic receptors. So we're not actually talking about actual risk yet, but it's a potential risk, keeping in mind that the exposure point concentration was a very conservative estimate of exposure, meaning the highest concentration that was measured for each of these time periods, and the toxicity screening value was a very conservative measure of a concentration that would be protective of aquatic receptors. And so we've gone through the process for each of the contaminants of potential concern for which we had data available. And where you see a hazard quotient greater than 1, those then are the substances which were identified as potential substances that potentially could pose risks to sockeye salmon within the Fraser River Basin, for one or more of these life history stages.
So if we were to look under major ions at chloride, for example, dissolved chloride, this assessment would say that it's not a risk until you hit the adult upstream migration, and at that point it becomes a risk.
Correct.
Okay, and then
Potential risk, yes.
Potential risk, and then the maximum value across those 4 life stages is what is carried forward into the column all life stages.
That's correct.
Okay. In your report at page 53, this is where you, I think, deal with some of the information that's in this table. There's just at the very bottom of the page, there's a couple of sentences. I just want to make sure we understand what they mean. It begins the very last 2 lines. These results suggest that water quality conditions have degraded over the past 2 decades. However, the results were reversed for the juvenile rearing and smolt outmigration life stages. What does that refer to?
This refers to the results that are presented in table 4.50.
Okay, which is the next page over to T203.
Yes.
I think, Mr. Lyon, if we can leave this text page and go right to the table T203.
Great. So there are times where you're delighted with the way that you've constructed a table, and then there are times that you wish you would put a little bit more information in the table. And this is a place where I wish I had put these percentages explicitly in these tables so it would be a little easier to follow. But what that text on the bottom of the page referred to was comparisons between the pre- and post-1990 periods for each of the life stages. And just to let you know what these numbers mean, first of all, if you go to the final row in the table where it says Fraser River Basin, and you'll see a number of numbers as you work across for spawning and incubation pre-1990. What this means is that 15 of the 25 substances for which we had data had concentrations that exceeded the toxicity screening value. And so what that means is that 60%, 15 of 25, 60% of those contaminants had exceedances. If you go to the next column, you'll see the post-1990 data, and you'll see 18 of 25 of the contaminants had exceedances, those conservative toxicity screening values. That corresponds to a rate of about 67%.
I think you said 18 out of 25. You meant 18 out of 27?
Yes, that's correct. Thank you.
Just so we know that we're looking at the right place.
I apologize for that, and appreciate you correcting that. And then as you work across, and you can calculate percentages as well. And long story short is what we saw for spawning and incubation was a higher percentage of the contaminants exceeded the benchmarks post-1990. And that was also true for upstream migration, where we had a higher percentage of the contaminants that exceeded the toxicity screening value in the post-1990 timeframe. Contrary to that, for the juvenile rearing, we had slightly higher percentages in the pre-1990 period. for the percentage of the substances that exceeded the benchmarks. And the same was true also for the smolt outmigration life phase, where there was a slightly higher percentage of the contaminants that exceeded the benchmarks during that time. And so what we did not see was a consistently higher percentage across all of the life stages for that post-1990 period, which is what one might expect if these contaminants were the primary drivers of effects on all of these life stages. What it does tell you is that you do have, for the incubation phase and for the adult upstream migration phase, some higher percentages of incidence of exceedance of the benchmarks. And so those are places where you might say there could be some correlation between changes in abundance of sockeye and changes in conditions within the system over those pre-1990 to post-1990 time periods.
And this information we've just reviewed, tables 4.49 and 4.50, are all in relation to surface water, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, and then the next piece you looked at was sediments, and that is also set out conveniently in a table, table 4.53, which is pages 208 and 209.
Yes, that's correct.
All right, so if you can explain this table.
So this table is very similar to the last table, but you'll see that there are a couple of differences that are notable. One is you'll see only 4 areas of interest represented in this table, compared to, for the water quality, there were tables for each of the areas of interest just prior to the one that we talked about, the summary table. And you'll see that these data were not separated into 2 time periods, pre and post 1990. And the reason for that, for both of those changes between, we would have liked to have done the assessment in the very same way that we did it for surface water, but the available data did not support that. And so what we see here is a summary that applies to all of the data that were available to us when we conducted this assessment. And what it identifies, again, is those hazard quotients for individual contaminants for the Fraser River as a whole, and identifies a series of metals that occurred at concentrations in excess of the toxicity screening values, and hence had hazard quotients greater than 1. And if you flip through this table to the next page as well, you'll see there were certain other contaminants that emerged as posing potential risks to aquatic receptors within the Fraser River Basin. That included one of the phthalates that we were able to evaluate, bis-2-ethylhexyl phthalate, and some polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. And there was 3 of those that occurred at concentrations in excess of the toxicity screening values in 1 or more locations within the system.
And what are those chemicals? What are the significance of those chemicals that you just reviewed?
Could you ask that question another way, please?
Yeah, sure. Why don't you tell me how you'd like to answer that question?
So what that says to me is that there are a number of substances that occur in sediments at concentrations sufficient to pose potential risks to aquatic organisms within the Fraser River Basin. And by and large, those risks are focused in the lower Fraser River Basin. It's very, very important, though, not to draw broad conclusions about this, because, again, the data are very limited, and as a result of that, there are many, many, many locations throughout the Fraser River for which we don't have any sediment chemistry data. And so while we've been able to identify the lower Fraser River as one of the key areas where we have some exceedances of these benchmarks, one should not conclude that that's the only place where these types of exceedances occur. It's simply based on our review of the existing data.
And what is a I'm not going to pronounce it right, so I'm going to spell it phthalate. What is that chemical?
So was that the first one under PAHs?
Yeah,
sorry.
under plastic-related chemicals.
Oh, bis-2-ethyl hexylphthalate?
Yeah,
That's
rolls
a...
off the tongue nicely.
We call it BEHP, just to avoid having to say the word out loud. That's a substance that's used as a plasticizer in the plastics-related industry. You also find it in things like motor oil. Outboard motor oil seems to contain substantial quantities of that, and so it's a substance that we find in many places that we look across North America.
All right. And many of these columns have ND, which I understand stands for no data, particularly once you get outside of the Lower Fraser. What data were you able to actually use when you did this assessment?
We used data from several sources for the sediment chemistry data. And they included the EMS database that we talked about previously that is administered by the province of British Columbia. Also, we were able to access some data that were available from GVRD in one of their annual reports. I believe that report was dated 2006. And I believe those were the two main sources. There may have been one or two other minor sources, but those were the main sources.
Address the broad reaches of the Fraser River.
No.
And what impact does that have on the work that you were doing?
Well, it's the challenge is that we have virtually no data for spawning areas within the Fraser River system. We had no data for the rearing areas within the Fraser River Basin. The data for the Lower Fraser provided us with some indication of where we may have some exposure within those migration routes. May have some relevance to the early rearing that occurs for at least one of the stocks down in the Lower Fraser. But again, those data were not necessarily co-located with those locations where the sockeye salmon, those relatively smaller number of sockeye salmon, actually rear within the Lower Fraser. So it's difficult to use these data explicitly to evaluate what the exposure of sockeye salmon was to sediment-associated contaminants and hence the risk. As a sort of an add-on to that, I'd also like to mention, we don't expect to see a lot of contaminated sediments within the areas that sockeye are actively spawning and rearing for the most part. So there's spawning in largely the headwater systems or main stem areas further up the Fraser. Those are typically spatially isolated from a lot of the point source releases of contaminants into the system, and the kinds of places where you expect to see contaminated sediments deposited. Those are typically the slow-moving areas where you have soft-bottom sediments. Those are not typically the areas that a lot of salmon would be using for spawning purposes anyway. That is not necessarily true for rearing, but it is for all stocks, but it is for incubation. And so if there was exposure during incubation, it would be to a relatively small percentage of the contaminated sediments that might be incorporated within that matrix that they use for spawning within the stream bed.
Okay, thank you. And then one last question on this topic, and then we'll take the morning break, I think, is if you can go to your report, at the text of your report, page 55, in the text body of your report.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the page again?
55, it's on the screen now in front of you. You set out 3 substances with bullets.
Yes.
What is the significance of these 3 that you've set out?
So those are the 3 groups of substances that had hazard quotients greater than 1. So those are the substances that pose potential risk to aquatic organisms within the Fraser River Basin, utilizing those areas where those contaminated sediments occur. And within each of those groups, there are a number of substances that are explicitly identified. The flip side of this, of that statement, though, is that there are a variety of other substances for which there was insufficient information to conduct an evaluation, and so we're left with a higher level of uncertainty in a sediment type assessment than we would be otherwise if we had data for a large number of places and a large number of contaminants that we thought had been discharged into the system.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, it's 11:14, so this would be a good time to break, and then we'll move to the next chapter of his report.
Just before we break, Ms. Baker, I wonder if you could just talk earlier about availability of data from the Crown. And I wonder if you could just outline for us where he went to get this data, specifically within the framework of the legislative provisions that exist within the province, or even federally, if that is an appropriate source of data. But if you could just tell me, because you mentioned Treasury Board, and I wasn't quite following why there would be data there and not somewhere else.
It was also surprising to me to see that the Treasury Board was administering a database of contaminated sites. So that data that we accessed from that source was specifically about where certain contaminated sites were within the system and what types of sites those were. So beyond that, we tried to access data from a variety of different sources, provincial sources, meaning the EMS system, that's their data warehouse, from federal sources, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Environment Canada, from the GBRD, as well as other sources that we may have identified during our reviews of the scientific literature, and keeping in mind that with the short time frame, we needed to be able to access data that were electronically available rather than data that were sequestered in written reports somewhere where we would have to then retype all that data into a database and then evaluate it, etc. So the data then that we relied on then was largely from that EMS system administered by the province.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, we'll take the break then.
Hearing will now recess for 15 minutes.